Hello, I'm Paul Louis Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins, and thank you for joining us for another episode of New Wine Tastings, where we seek to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. And New Wine, New Wineskins is all about that, and New Wine Tastings is giving a taste of what that might look like. And we're dealing with the theme of advocacy, a series on advocacy, and one of the themes we want to deal with is what we're titling this episode, and that is Make a Point, Not an Enemy. And joining me is Pastor Tom Schiave, who is lead pastor at Gateway Church in Portland, Oregon, who's an advisory council member for New Wine, New Wineskins, and really gives me a lot of insight and perspective as it relates to advocacy and navigating conflicts. And Tom, thanks for joining us at New Wine Tastings today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Always good to be here, and thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, and Tom, before we get going, just share with me, who would you say is probably the greatest influence in your life as a pastor for how you deal with conflict and advocacy work?
Oh, well, right here, he's sitting right back there. You can see it, the Godfather, right back there. He's looking right over my shoulder. So,
That's right.
yeah, if I don't do well here, I'm in trouble. He'll break my knees. So,
Tom wheels him into every elders meeting, and
he's at the head of the table.
Yeah, I think it was John Stuart Mill at University College London or Jeremy Bentham, I can't remember, that they wheel in his or his body or something to that effect. So I don't know if you're doing that at Gateway, but this is going to be sobering for people on what does that mean to make a point, not an enemy, and make him an offer he can't refuse, is what Dr. Corleone said. So as I say, Pastor Schiave is with us, and I often affectionately refer to him as the Godfather. And so we're going to deal with this theme of advocacy and emotional intelligence and things of that sort. So Tom, you dedicate a lot of time when you're not watching Godfather 1, 2, and 3. You dedicate a lot of your time to emotional intelligence. Why is that, and how does that relate to the theme of advocacy?
Well, I think, let me just kind of start with a brief introduction. I think part of it was I grew up in an all-male single-parent home where there wasn't the female presence there, and so it was more guys just relating to each other. And I have to admit that when I got married, my wife Kathy just is an outstanding listener. And there were times when she would be talking to me, times when she would be listening to me, and she'd say, "Gee, Tom, you're pretty defensive. Gee, Tom, you're pretty defensive." And I couldn't make my point without kind of being defensive. And she really pointed that out to me. She's an outstanding listener. When you look at her, she looks right at you and asks you all these great questions. So she's been great. I work with two very emotionally intelligent people here at the office. Caitlin Hostetler is a counselor on our staff here. She very emotionally intelligent. Our office administrator, Crystal Eddy, is very emotionally intelligent. And I have a friend, Frank Barsati, and he's been the biggest influence in this area for me. He got his master's in union negotiation. And I have him come into my classes at Multnomah and talk about emotional intelligence, because he was the employee relations director for HP for 30 years. Wow. Every conflict that came to HP came to his desk. Wow. And so he became a kind of, advocate and expert in the area of emotional intelligence. And so I just took a liking to Frank a lot. And he and I would talk about some of these issues. He would say things like, Tom, people go on strike not because they want more money, they want to be heard. Which is really interesting. It isn't the issue of money. It was the issue of that's the only way they felt they could be heard in the midst of negotiation was to go on strike, because it was like nobody was listening to them. And listening is so important to advocacy. And then he made a statement to me one time that said, "Tom, people come to a job, but they leave for a boss." And what he meant by that was people usually like their jobs. It's the relationships that matter. And so I found, whether it's in ministry or it's in boardrooms or it's in faculty meetings, being able to make a point without making an enemy is absolutely crucial. the problems are more relational than they are content based.
Mhm.
And what I've discovered is, even being a pastor and talking with young pastors, they get asked to leave ministries because they don't have emotional intelligence, not because they don't have high IQ, not because they can't, articulate doctrine or preach. They don't know how to get along with people and manage their own emotions, as we'll, hopefully address in the next, few hours or next few minutes that we have together. So I see it as absolutely crucial to life and relationships. Marriages is the same way. Usually people are frustrated because their husband or wife doesn't listen,
Mm.
or they don't feel understood, or they feel like their opinion isn't valued. That's the problem. It's usually not little money, houses, cars, none of that. It has to do with relationships.
So Tom, as you said, in seminaries and such, education is so often, about biblical and theological studies, and that's important to me as a theologian.
Mhm.
It's rarely the case that in theology we are thinking about emotions, or in apologetics that we're thinking about emotions.
Right, right.
But it's so critical. And when I think about theology, and I bring this into systematic theology classes and into apologetics, it's not just orthodoxy, right teaching. It's not just orthopraxy, right practice. It's also orthopathy, right passion, right
Yep,
affection.
yep.
And that's core to emotional intelligence, and it's core to ministry. It's core to marriage. And as you said, so often it's not based on the money. It's not based on even the argument, depending on the context we're dealing with. It's based on how we relate to one another. And relationships are so core, so key. And New Wine, it's about building relational bridges through Jesus
Right,
in
right.
contemporary culture, and we seek to grow into that reality. Now, based on my recollection of The Godfather, Don Corleone made a lot of enemies as
Yeah,
he made his various points, right?
right.
He
Yeah,
wasn't all that good at resolving conflict. He would stifle conflict. He would crush conflict, and it was a matter of winning at all cost.
mhm.
And it haunted his family, right? I mean, and this isn't too much of
Good,
a spoiler because it's been
good.
out forever. You know, you reap what you sow. Michael Corleone in Godfather 3, he can't get away from it. He tries to pull out, but he
But he
keeps
can't
getting pulled in
pull back.
because it's the cycle of violence. And so, but you're a really good godfather. I mean, I'd say you're a very good godfather. You try to make points without making enemies. And why is it easy to make enemies while making points? Why is it easy to make enemies while making points?
I think that um, that issue goes back again to emotional intelligence. It goes back to the main structure of what emotional intelligence is. And this might be a good time to talk a little bit about emotional intelligence and what it is. So let's talk a little bit about that, because this is how you end up making an enemy instead of making your point without making an enemy, is a lack of emotional intelligence. So let me articulate a little bit about what emotional intelligence is. It's made up of two key things, Paul. It's recognizing and understanding emotions in ourselves and others, and then it's using that awareness to manage our behavior and relationships. And I
So say
think
those again, please. Can you say those again, please?
yeah, yeah. Emotional intelligence is made up of two key parts. It's recognize and understanding emotions in yourself and others. And it's then using this awareness to manage your behavior and relationships. That's what happens. So it's understanding where our emotions are and the emotions are in the person that we're talking to, and then using where we are and controlling ourselves in that, so that we can come to good mutual discussion without getting angry. Anger is probably one of the key things that happens to us. And emotional intelligence, is based on personal self-awareness and personal self-management, and then a relational awareness, and then relational self-management or relational management. So it's being in a conversation and then listening and caring and being able to manage that. I think a lot of times we want to be right or we want to be heard, but the goal of all good advocacy or good discussion is to let the other person be heard, to articulate their position, and to be a good listener, to be a very, very good listener to that person and what they're saying. It's kind of Covey's beautiful statement: seek to understand before being understood. And we reverse that a lot of times. We want to be understood. We want to make our point. We want to be sure they understand us, instead of saying, well, wait a minute, what's my goal? My goal is not for me to be understood. My goal is to understand them, so we can come to a good summary or a good compromise or whatever necessary when we advocate. That's a different goal. That's a different goal. And if we have that goal in mind of listening to them and understanding them, we're less likely to get angry, because the goal is to help them be understood. Once that happens, it's magic. Once people know they're understood and they're being listened to, things go so much better.
Yeah, and it's not that you're listening to them so that eventually you can make your point. You really want to make sure you're understanding them so you can work through the conflict. And if we do that with one another, oh my goodness, like, consider others better than yourselves. Listen to one another, right? Listen to one another. And I find that so hard, especially when emotions are way up here. It's so hard, and that's why it's important to hit that pause button and decompress and de-escalate, so that we can come back to listen and not to rush into it. And when we're advocating for people, we generally don't want to be advocating at the time when emotions are fever pitched. I mean, at times that is going to be done. At times you have no choice when it's like life emergency. Someone doesn't want to go out of the burning building, but the fireman has to pull them out of the burning building. There are times like that, or on the emergency, in the emergency room on the table. It's going to be like that. However, you're trying as much as possible, as often as possible, to de-escalate so you can get to the point of listening to one another. And that's core to advocacy. A lot of people think advocacy is just talking. Advocacy, as your friend said, is making sure people feel heard, feel valued. And that's almost counterintuitive to a lot of Americans, which is win at all costs. I hate to say it, but I think in our country, especially today, I find that it's win at all costs. And that's not working too well for us as a society or in the Christian community.
Well, we don't seek to understand. We seek to make our point. And that's, unfortunately, that's been, exacerbated by talk radio. I can make my point and nobody challenges me. I mean, we just don't sit down and say, okay, and this kind of advocacy where you really seek to listen, this kind of advocacy takes time. It takes time and it takes thought. James, in James chapter 1 verse 19 says, he says there, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. That's emotional intelligence. Quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Aristotle had this great statement, and I'll read it right now to us. It's in his Nicomachean Ethics. He says this: anyone can become angry. That is easy. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, that is not easy. And he's right. It's okay to be angry, but to be angry in the right way with the right amount of tone and so forth is an art form. It really, really is. And part of the other side of it, Paul, is that most communication, we always think it's words. We think that's what it's about. It's words. But most communication is tone and body language. And that communicates more. About 9% of what we say is important in a dialogue. The rest of it is body. The rest of it is body language and tone. Those things are so vital. In fact, those things probably take about 75% of the conversation, the tone we use. It's good to be passionate, But if you're too passionate, you've lost people. And that's it. Aristotle hit it right on the head. It's okay to be angry, but the right way at the right time for the right purpose. That's what's the art form in emotional intelligence.
There will be times, right, where it's done for the right reason, the right time, et cetera, and you're going to make other people angry. I mean, think of Jesus turning over the
Sure.
table.
Sure.
I don't think he did it just willy-nilly. He wasn't shooting from the hip. I think he had given a lot of thought to it, and he angered the establishment by what he did. And I think he intended to raise the bar and raise the stakes and to, in a sense, raise the emotion, I suppose.
Sure.
But it was for the right reason ultimately. And so it's not to say we're going to alleviate all conflict. Advocacy, in many respects, at many times, is going to intensify the conflict. But is it constructive conflict? And is the emotion fitting the situation? And I think that's in keeping with what you just said. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's Aristotle's point, is
Mhm.
that having the right amount of emotion at the right time. Jesus, if you look at Jesus in the Gospels, he's very thoughtful in the things that he does. Even this Sunday, after he comes off of the Mount of Transfiguration, he comes down to an argument, and he just asks a simple question: "What are you arguing about?" He doesn't go right in and say, "Hey, stop arguing." He says, "What are you arguing about? What's the argument about?" And he often asks those kind of questions, full of questions. And that's one way that you can kind of put a lid on the anger, is asking questions that help understand things and help them articulate what they think. So
Mm.
I agree with you, Paul. I think, yeah, there are going to be those moments when you've got to, stand up, but there are, most of the time in advocacy, a gentle answer turns away wrath.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Tom. And then, we asked the question, you answered it. Why is it so easy to make enemies while making points? Well, we're not listening often. We're just wanting to make our point. And why is it so important to advocacy work that we make points without making enemies? That is, if we want our points to stick. And in a sense, I'm kind of answering the question,
Yeah.
but I'd really like for you to develop it further. Why is it so important that, in advocacy work, we make points without making enemies? Why do that? Why try not to make enemies while making one's point?
Because you want to have a collaborative dialogue later on that. You want to have them as allies. You want to turn them into allies. You want to have allies that work together. And here's another idea. The last impression we leave people leaves a lasting impression. So the last impression leaves a lasting impression. In other words, how people feel in the moment is more important necessarily with what we've said in that moment. In fact, this is Maya Angelou. We know her from her writings. She says, people may not remember what you said, may not remember what you did, but people will always remember the way you made them feel. And if we don't advocate in a gentle way with understanding, people go away with a bad taste in their mouth, and they don't want to even advocate later with us. They don't want to compromise. They don't want to listen, because we haven't left them with a good feeling. And we want to make allies with them, and we want to come together and be a cooperative team in the issues that we want to discuss. We want them to be our allies, not our enemies.
Yeah, and I would agree with her point generally. I mean, I think there are situations where if someone's not reasonable and all they're about is winning, and let's say you show them respect and rapport, they might see that as a sign of weakness when it wasn't. And so, I mean, I think her point is a great principle. I think it by and large stands. However, there are times where you're dealing with people who are just completely irrational and are not operating according to sound judgment. For anyone who's operating according to sound judgment and they're after, there are people who would generally want the same kind of thrust, who are seeking after healthy, effective change, then I think that pertains really well. So I'm not trying to take away from the point. I've been in enough situations where my last impression was respectful and the like, and it wasn't me trying to win. But I think there have been times where people think they won because they made their point and they just came at it guns a-blazing. And maybe I've been guilty of that too at times. But for those people, that's winning. And there are enough people in our society that they just look at that as weakness, to operate that way. And they saw Jesus as weak, in that regard, when he was actually very, very strong. So not taking away from the point, but I think it's, on the whole, that last statement is the lasting impression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no question about that. And people are, very, very intuitive, and they do feel deeply. And if we damage them or hurt them, it's going to be very difficult to win them over. Extremely hard to advocate for a point if we have hurt them or their emotions have been damaged in any way. It's just not going to work. You can work with all the information, you can even be right, but you're not going to win, or I shouldn't say win, you are not going to make your point.
Mhm.
You'll never get them back, and it'll take you a lot longer to get them back.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
How do you go about making points while seeking to guard against making enemies? And so, we're developing this point from different angles, but what are some practical ways besides, or in addition to listening and making sure you're really hearing what they're after? What are some other situations, examples, Tom, where you have done just that? Making points without making enemies. How have you gone about it in particular situations? Any examples?
Well, I remember we had an issue here at the church, and we were talking about a major focus, a strategic change in what we wanted to do here. And I remember that somebody got up in the middle of a meeting and challenged me publicly, and said, could I name this, name that, name this, and instead of doing battle with them, I invited them to come on up to the podium, and I said, you make some very interesting points there. Why don't you come on up and share with us, and give us, your understanding of why your position is so important. And the chairman of the elders and I stepped back and kind of leaned against the wall, and he made his point very clearly. He was very firm. He was a little bit harsh about the situation, but he then invited me up, and I said, you make some good points. Is it okay if I answer those points that you've just made? And I stood up there with him, and I kind of put my arm around him, and I answered those points. And I said, you make some really, really good points, but here are the issues that we're talking about here. And I said, deeply, I trust you, I respect you, and your opinion is very valid here, but I think we have to see the other side of this. And he got up, and he went and back and sat down, and a number of the congregation said, hey, thank you, for letting him come on up. What was really interesting on that, Paul, it was he got very heated, was his daughter was out there in the congregation, and she called me the next day and said, thank you for treating my father with such deep respect. And that really impacted her, and the issue we were advocating ultimately passed with flying colors. But she said, you treated my dad with respect. That's the first time I've seen that happen. And that made an impression, and he's become a fan. I mean, of Gateway, and he's still, even though he's homebound, he's still very, very positive about Gateway Church. And when I go see him, he still appreciates me coming over. And I think that's just one very practical way that we see it. Another practical way is to articulate their point of view, to really listen and say, well, here's what I hear you saying. And am I correct in hearing you say that? And I want to be sure I understand, because I don't want to, discuss my position if I don't fully understand yours. Len Sweet said, the best way to understand someone is to stand under them. And I thought that was a great point. is to put myself underneath them and let them teach me what they want to teach, what they're advocating for, and try to just keep my mind open to what they're saying. I think that's a great point, you know, to understand people, stand under them, you know, to understand someone else's position, stand under them. You become the student and let them be the teacher for the moment that you need in order to get the most understanding. That's another way. Another way is to ask questions like, well, obviously we're at a little bit of a loggerhead here. What should we do to move forward? What do you feel we can do to move forward on this issue? You know, and put it in their court. What do you feel we should do to move forward? And that's just being open to hear what they have, and to be open to what they have to say. Just doing that, I think, is important. One other thing, don't dump too much information on people while you're in these discussions, because things can get lost in the middle of the dialogue. Sometimes we, instead of just slowly disseminating information, we sort of back up like a dump truck and just dump on them a whole load of information, and they get lost in it. And if they don't understand it, they feel threatened. So
Yeah, excellent feedback. Excellent input.
yeah, they feel threatened. And so the best thing is to just disseminate information in small doses so they have moments to understand it. Because so often we just dump a lot on them without saying, well, wait a minute, let's look at this thing. I think that's another important strategy to provide for good advocacy and being a good advocate.
And, and I think it's not lost on our viewers and listeners that, as you're engaged in this, you think a lot about this stuff. You really give a lot of your energy to matters of emotional intelligence, self-management, self-awareness. You seek to be aware of others, managing of situations, not to control situations, because that will only cause more tension when people feel like you're controlling the situation, but to manage in terms of seeking appropriate forms of engagement is key. And, and I think a lot of times it requires hitting that pause button. We alluded to that earlier. As much as possible, hit that pause button, process in a way that, okay, if I'm not careful here as I go into this situation, I am going to blow up. My anger is going to surface, and it's going to surface quickly. So how to, in a sense, premeditate, to self-manage, to get yourself in sync. And I think you're often doing that. I think it's almost a default. Now it's not a fault, it's a default. I think you're prepared where you don't allow things to shut down or get off point in terms of what really, really matters. Now, you've seen in our situation, as I'm dealing with advocacy work for my son over the last several months and for his family in the midst of his traumatic brain injury, I'm having to be baptized with fire. I mean, I've been about advocacy work for a long time in different ways, but just not as close to home in this particular domain as relates to such matters as medical care. And I've been very grateful for so many very skilled and caring medical practitioners, experts in a variety of domains. There are times when I have to advocate and advocate strongly, but I'm trying to do it in a way that makes the point, not the enemy. And I've been able to go to you at points to say, Tom, here's how I'm thinking about going about it. What do you think? Any thoughts that you would have as I enter into this? And, one of the things that I try and do is see if anyone else there has made the same point. And I think, if I can find other people who are making the same point in a hospital or a care facility, I think it helps strengthen the argument, where I'm not strengthening my argument, I'm strengthening our argument. That would be standard. I think a lot of times we get ourselves into trouble when we are not being reasonable. What we're after is something that there's no way in the world a facility, a hospital or a care center could provide that kind of care. It's just not what they're able to do. But when you know what is rightfully expected of them and what they expect of themselves, if they're not holding to it in some ways, and you can see how many of them want to hold to it and find those people who are of reasonable orientation, you can make headway, because it's really our point, their point, our point, coming alongside, being under and trying to learn systems to advocate. It's finding the points that you already agree on. Like you said to this gentleman, you said, here's where I sense there's agreement. I respect you. I appreciate you. You're trying to honor him. You're trying. And I think whenever they realize it's not just about you,
Right.
or your own loved one, but you're about healthy structures and you're advocating for the whole to make something that's really good, great, or greater, then they can hear it a lot more readily. Would you agree with that? I'm thinking you, I think you do, but I just, would you agree that?
Yeah, you're spot on there. And they appreciate that when you help them succeed in a better way, they feel better about that. That is so true. That's so true. When you encourage them, when you help them succeed at what they're doing, when you perhaps give them a tool or you respond in a certain way, they walk away saying, hey, I'm a better person for that conversation. I learned something. Of course, there's no better way to go about it, Paul. Yeah.
Yeah,
Gaining
and I
an
think we
ally.
all,
Yeah,
and I think we all make mistakes along the way, and hopefully we learn from our
absolutely.
mistakes. But it really is a matter of, that respect and shared values wherever we can find them, and advocate based on it. Dr. King, in making his points, not trying to make enemies, he tried to honor systems that, like values, like the founding fathers document. He said, we're just not holding to it. He was
Mhm.
appealing to them to be more consistent in the current day in the fight for civil rights. But he always engaged in a way that was respectful.
Mhm. Well, and
Um,
he always engaged, as you know, Paul. Those who marched with him had to sign an agape covenant that they would love, that they would love their enemy, that they would not be prone to violence, that they would not move to any sort of physical violence in any way. And Dr. King was great that way. He made them act in love, and that
yeah,
was great. That was
and
important for him.
and even
He's
though
my
they were,
hero. He's my
yeah,
hero.
though
Yeah.
they were thought as being weak, they were actually much stronger than the victimizers who were using violence
Yeah.
against innocent parties who were nonviolent in their civil disobedience for laws that were more just than the laws of the land.
Hmm.
And so, how do you go about making points while seeking to guard against making enemies? You've been getting at that all along, but any concluding practical steps that you would suggest people make? What steps should people take as they prepare to advocate?
Well, I think, Paul, one of the things that we've been talking about here, and I've heard you say it a number of times, is really um, looking at yourself and asking yourself in conversations, why am I getting angry about this? What is this that deals with it? If you have an anger issue, you should take care of that. You should find out, why am I angry, or what is making me angry? And to really learn to practice some good self-management and anger management. I can't emphasize that enough. That to be a good advocate, you've got to learn listening skills, and you've got to also deal with your own, emotions inside. Yeah, and you've said it a couple of times here. I give you just a quick example, and this is a very minor one, but I'm heading out to the coast next week and taking a week off just to practice some self-care, which we'll talk about next time. Um, and I got a call from the hotel I'm staying at, and they said, "Hey, I wanted you to know that the room that you had reserved is no longer available." Now, I had to immediately, say, "Uh-oh." I could have said, "Uh-oh, why?" And I could have gotten into this discussion with this guy because my room's no longer available. But I waited. I waited. I said, "Okay." I said, "So, what can we do? What can we do?" And he said, "Well, You can cancel if you'd like to, because I would understand if you completely canceled it. Or he said, you can have a king room, or I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll upgrade you to a room with a lot more amenities in it. I said, well, I'll take the one with the amenities in it, of course, you know. And I said, thank you so much for the phone call. I said, that was really kind of you to call me in advance, let me know what's going on. I said, it would be more difficult for me if I got to the desk. And he said, you know, he said, I would never rent you a room that I wasn't proud of. And he said, I really appreciate you encouraging me that way. Because he said, we make these calls and we wonder if they're helpful. I said, it's very helpful. Now I know what to expect. I don't have to be at the desk wondering what's going on. And he said, thank you. And it's just, again, turning the conversation around to a more positive. I could have sat there and said, well, why'd you cancel my room? And what are you doing? You know, I made this reservation 3-4 weeks ago. I could have got into all of that, but just waiting and asking questions brought it to a really great positive end. That's emotional intelligence in a very small way.
He didn't tell you that I was the one who asked, you know, could I take that room? I'll pay you $50 more for it. He didn't tell you that, did he, Tom?
No, he didn't tell me that, but you might get your car keyed when you get there or something, you know.
But I mean, but again, if you had flown off the handle, you wouldn't have gotten that better room. You wouldn't have got a positive connection with the guy. And we are prone often, like with road rage, to just fly off the handle at every turn. We don't have space between our car and the next car. We don't create space in conversation.
Yeah, my wife, Kathy, is the most merciful person around. Somebody cuts me off. She's got 9 reasons why they potentially could have done. They had a bad day. Their phone's not working. Maybe they have an upset stomach. Maybe they just got fired at their job. She'll come up with, you know, a million different reasons why people can do what they can do. But that's her mercy side, you know, that's her mercy side, which keeps her from ever losing her cool. She rarely loses her cool because she understands people make mistakes. I would encourage people to work on their own emotions, really dig down deep and say, how have my relationships been, you know, with people? Where have I gone wrong? What areas do I need to be stronger on? Let me just share a couple of things. There's a number of books written by Daniel Goleman. One of these is called Emotional Intelligence. This is the original book. Daniel Goleman was the one who kind of brought this all into business and into discussion. This is the original one written in about 1998. And then Goleman has come up with a number of other ones. These are all ones that I've worked through. He's come up with working with emotional intelligence, that's working with people. This one on primal leadership is about being a leader who exercises emotional intelligence. And then his newest one here is social intelligence. And it's all about working through our relationships with other people. I know this is all backwards. Maybe it looks like it, but
it's fine. No, it's fine.
Yeah, this is another one on working with social intelligence. The best way to get started in emotional intelligence and the best way to begin is to pick up a copy of this book right here. This is the book really to pick up. It's Emotional Intelligence 2.0 by Travis Bradbury and Gene Greaves. I took all of my staff through this, and in the back is a test that you do online. And you take the test and then you print it off, very much like Strength Finders, Paul.
Mhm.
And you take the test and then you run it off, and you end up with a handout that looks like this. It's an emotional intelligence appraisal. This is mine right here, which was taken in 2013. So that was 8 years ago, as a matter of fact. Okay. And yeah, it's got a Godfather category here. But if you look at it, it gives you your scores and your personal competence and your social competence, and it scores you. And it gives you a high and a low score. And then this book, Emotional Intelligence 2.0, really helps you get skills and tools that can help you with the areas of weakness and strength. Very simple.
Well, I appreciate how you bring that into your pastoral work. and grateful for you as one of the leaders at New Wine, New Wineskins, with a group of other
Yeah.
pastoral leaders and people of other walks of life navigating these matters. And as we're dealing with the subject of advocacy, whether it's in the church or in society at large or in our homes, how we go about making our points is all important. And we're trying to affect change, but hopefully in a way that also cultivates relational trust. And so I'm very grateful for both you as a person, as a pastor, and also for making time in this episode, Tom, for New Wine Tastings. Is there any closing thought or thoughts that you'd wish to share?
I guess we've talked a lot about this, but I cannot overemphasize the importance of emotional intelligence in articulating an advocacy. You will find it a lot smoother. You will find yourself a lot healthier. You'll find your advocacy more joyful and effective if you use emotional intelligence. You will find it so difficult when you don't, exercise good personal self-management, and relationships can blow up so quickly. I've just seen that happen. And what we've talked about today, I truly believe is just a game changer in all areas of personal relationships. It has been with me. And I've had long-term staff here for over 10 years because we treat each other with great emotional intelligence and respect. And people are willing to work hard for you. They're willing to work, even for less, as long as they know they're understood and their points are made and you're listening to them. That goes such a long way. I can't overemphasize this enough. It's a key in all relationships, particularly in the church.
So we'll take away from this conversation two statements. In addition to make the point, not make enemies, it'll be, hey, it's nothing personal, Michael. It's just business. And and the more biblical point here would be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Great emotional intelligence for advocacy. And Tom, Pastor Tom, thank you for joining us. And Don Corleone, thank you for joining us in the background there.
I'm back there, Paul.
So I'm Paul Louis Metzger, signing off for Pastor Tom Schiave, myself. Blessings to all of you as you seek to make points without making enemies, to listen first and seeking to understand before being understood. Boy, that's something we all need to do. God bless you all as you pursue that line of engagement.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you for having me.
Yep. Thank you, Tom. Goodbye.
Bye.